Think about your morning routine. You wake up, maybe check your phone, brush your teeth, make coffee, go about your day without thinking twice about whether there will be food in the grocery store or medicine at the pharmacy or electricity to power your lights. Now imagine waking up one morning and all of that is gone. The supermarket shelves are empty. The hospitals have no supplies. The money in your pocket is worthless, losing half its value by sunset. That's not a dystopian movie. That's Venezuela. And the man responsible for turning one of South America's wealthiest nations into one of its poorest is, as of 3 days ago, sitting in a prison cell in New York. Here's something that might blow your mind. Nicolás Maduro, the man who ruled Venezuela for 13 years, the man who oversaw hyperinflation so severe that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread, the man who stole an election so brazenly that the entire world watched in real time as he fabricated results, started his career driving a bus. Not as a political metaphor. An actual bus. Through the streets of Caracas. Collecting fares, navigating traffic, living a completely ordinary working-class life. And now, on January 3, 2026, just 3 days ago, he became the first sitting head of state in modern history to be captured by American special forces in a midnight raid and flown out of his own country in handcuffs. President Trump posted the photo himself. Maduro blindfolded, wearing headphones, sitting on a military ship headed to face narco-terrorism charges. The image went viral within minutes. A dictator reduced to a prisoner. A man who once controlled an entire nation now controlled by others. So how does a bus driver become a dictator? How does someone with no formal education beyond high school end up destroying a country's economy so thoroughly that 7 million people, nearly a quarter of the population, fled across borders with whatever they could carry? How does a man who started with genuine beliefs about helping the poor end up presiding over a humanitarian catastrophe where children died from malnutrition and treatable diseases because hospitals had no medicine? The answer isn't what you might think. It's not about one evil person ruining everything. It's not about socialism versus capitalism or left versus right. It's about something way more fascinating and way more human. It's about loyalty turning into blindness, about power corrupting gradually and then suddenly, about a political movement that started with real ideals and real support transforming into a criminal enterprise that trafficked drugs and stole elections. It's about how ordinary people become dictators, not through some master plan, but through a series of choices that seem reasonable at the time until you look back and realize you've crossed lines you never thought you would. Every dictator alive today, all of them, started somewhere ordinary. They weren't born evil. They didn't emerge from the womb planning to destroy their countries. They were babies who cried when they were hungry, children who played in streets, teenagers who had dreams, young adults who believed they could make the world better. Nicolás Maduro was born on November 23, 1962, in a working-class neighborhood in Caracas. His father was a union organizer. His mother was the daughter of Colombian immigrants. He grew up in a modest apartment, played in the streets with neighborhood kids, went to school, fell in love, had hopes for the future. Completely normal. Completely ordinary. And then, slowly, through a combination of historical accidents, political opportunities, unwavering loyalty to a charismatic leader, and his own choices both good and bad, he ended up ruling Venezuela. And then destroying it. And then, just days ago, being pulled from a building by American special forces while explosions lit up the Caracas sky and his 13-year grip on power evaporated in a matter of hours. This is the entire story of Nicolás Maduro. From bus driver to dictator to prisoner. From promising to continue a revolution to becoming the reason that revolution failed. From being seen as Hugo Chávez's loyal lieutenant to being remembered as the man who ruined Venezuela. It's a story that just ended 3 days ago with one of the most dramatic military operations in modern Latin American history. But to understand that ending, to understand how we got from a baby born in Caracas in 1962 to a blindfolded prisoner on a ship in 2026, we need to go back to the beginning. And this story is perfect for falling asleep to because history doesn't rush. It unfolds slowly, one decision at a time, 1 year bleeding into the next, patterns emerging that no one saw coming until it was too late. There are no jump scares here, no plot twists designed to shock you awake. Just the patient, methodical story of how an ordinary man became extraordinary in all the worst ways, and how that story finally came to its end. So let's begin at the beginning, in a city that was once called the Jewel of South America, a city built on oil money and grand dreams, a city that in 1962 could not have possibly imagined that 64 years later, one of its own bus drivers would be captured by American forces and flown away in the middle of the night, leaving his country to pick up the pieces of everything he'd broken. Nicolás Maduro Moros came into the world in Caracas, the sprawling capital city of Venezuela, on a warm November day in 1962. The world was different then. John F. Kennedy was in the White House. The Cold War was at its peak, with the Cuban Missile Crisis having just concluded the month before. Venezuela itself was riding high on oil wealth, its economy booming, its democracy seemingly stable after years of military dictatorship. Into this world came a boy who would, in ways no one could have predicted, help bring that prosperity crashing down. He was born into a working-class family in El Vale, a neighborhood on the western outskirts of Caracas. The area was called Los Jardines, the Gardens, though it was far from the manicured estates of the city's wealthy districts. This was a place of concrete apartment buildings, narrow streets, small shops where neighbors knew each other's names. It was a place where people worked with their hands, where union solidarity mattered, where leftist politics found fertile ground among families who labored hard and saw little reward. Nicolás was the only boy among 4 children. He had 3 sisters, Maria Teresa, Josefina, and Anita, who would remain largely out of the public eye as their brother's political career took off decades later. The household was run by his mother, Teresa de Jesus Moros, a woman who had been born in Cúcuta, a Colombian border town. Years later, this detail would spark controversy, with political opponents claiming that Maduro himself might be Colombian by birth, questioning his eligibility to serve as Venezuela's president. The Venezuelan Supreme Court would eventually rule in Maduro's favor, stating with what they called incontrovertible evidence that he had been born in Caracas. But the whispers about his mother's Colombian heritage would never fully disappear. His father was Nicolás Maduro Garcia, and if there was one person who would shape young Nicolás's political worldview more than anyone else, it was him. The elder Maduro was a prominent trade union leader, a man who believed deeply in workers' rights, in collective action, in the power of organized labor to challenge the established order. He was described as a militant dreamer, a member of the Movimiento Electoral del Pueblo, the People's Electoral Movement, a left-wing political party that fought for socialist policies in a country where the gap between rich and poor kept widening despite all the oil wealth flowing through the economy. Growing up on Calle 14, Street 14, in Los Jardines, young Nicolás would have seen his father leave for union meetings, would have heard conversations about strikes and negotiations, about bosses and workers, about the injustices built into the capitalist system. This was the air he breathed from childhood. Politics wasn't an abstract concept in the Maduro household. It was life. It was how you survived. It was how you fought back against a system that seemed designed to keep working people down. The family was Catholic, as most Venezuelan families were. Nicolás was raised in the faith, attending church, learning the prayers and rituals. But later in life, his spiritual journey would take unexpected turns. By 2012, it would be reported that he had become a follower of Satya Sai Baba, an Indian Hindu guru. He had visited India in 2005 to meet with the guru, a journey that spoke to a searching quality in Maduro's character, a desire to find meaning beyond the material struggles of Venezuelan politics. In a 2013 interview, he would claim that his grandparents had been Jewish, from a Sephardic Moorish background, and had converted to Catholicism after arriving in Venezuela. Whether this was true or an attempt to claim a more diverse heritage, it suggested someone constructing a personal narrative that extended beyond the simple facts of his working-class upbringing. But all of that was still far in the future. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Nicolás was just another kid growing up in western Caracas, attending José Avalos High School in El Vale, where he would serve as president of the student union. Even then, leadership roles came naturally to him. Even then, he was drawn to organizing, to speaking, to bringing people together around common causes. He wasn't a particularly strong student academically. He wouldn't graduate from high school in the traditional sense. But he was developing other skills, skills that would serve him well in the political arena, the ability to connect with people, to understand what they wanted to hear, to present himself as one of them, a man of the people. Tragedy struck the Maduro family on April 22, 1989. Nicolás Maduro Garcia, the father who had shaped so much of his son's worldview, died in a motor vehicle accident. By this time, Young Nicholas was already 26 years old, already working, already becoming involved in the labor movement himself. The loss of his father must have been profound, not just emotionally but also politically. His father had been his connection to the world of union organizing, his guide into the networks of leftist politics that existed on the margins of Venezuelan society. Now he would have to navigate that world on his own. But before we get to his political awakening, before we talk about his transformation from bus driver to revolutionary, we need to understand what Caracas was like in those years, what Venezuela was like, because the country Nicolás Maduro grew up in was very different from the country he would one day help destroy. Venezuela in the 1960s and 1970s was a place of enormous contrasts. On one hand, it was fantastically wealthy, at least by Latin American standards. Oil had been discovered there in the early 20th century, and by mid-century, Venezuela was one of the world's leading petroleum exporters. Money flowed into Caracas. Skyscrapers rose. The middle class expanded. Per capita income climbed to levels that rivaled some European nations. There was a sense that Venezuela was special, that it had been blessed with natural resources that would guarantee prosperity for generations. But all that wealth was unevenly distributed. While the elite lived in luxury in the hills above Caracas, in neighborhoods with guards and gates and stunning views of the valley below, the majority of Venezuelans lived in places like El Vale, in modest homes, working jobs that barely covered expenses, watching the oil money enrich everyone except them. And in the barrios, the sprawling slums that clung to hillsides around the capital, people lived in poverty that the oil boom had barely touched at all. The political system was stable but corrupt. After the fall of the Marcos Pérez Jiménez dictatorship in 1958, Venezuela had established what was called the Punto Fijo Pact, an agreement between the major political parties to share power and prevent any one faction from dominating. On paper, it looked like democracy. Elections were held. Presidents changed. But in practice, the same elite families, the same business interests, the same old guard politicians kept rotating through positions of power. They took their cuts. They enriched themselves and their friends. And they told the Venezuelan people to be grateful for the stability. By the 1980s, cracks were starting to show. The oil boom was over. Prices dropped. The economy, which had been built entirely on petroleum exports with almost no economic diversification, began to struggle. Poverty increased. Inflation crept upward. The promises of prosperity started to ring hollow, especially to young people like Nicolás Maduro who were entering the workforce during a period of economic uncertainty. This was the Venezuela that shaped him. A country that had everything it needed to succeed, oil reserves that should have made everyone comfortable, but somehow couldn't translate that natural wealth into shared prosperity. A country where working people kept getting poorer while the elite kept getting richer. A country where the political system felt rigged, where voting seemed pointless because the same corrupt parties just kept passing power back and forth between themselves. It's important to understand this context because it explains why Maduro, and millions of Venezuelans like him, would later embrace Hugo Chavez and his Bolivarian revolution with such fervor. They weren't crazy. They weren't brainwashed. They were responding rationally to a system that had failed them, looking for someone, anyone, who promised real change. That Maduro would later become part of an even more corrupt, even more oppressive system is one of the great ironies of this story. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, he had to become a bus driver. Nicolás Maduro didn't have the grades or the money to pursue higher education after high school. He needed to work. He needed income. So like many young men from working-class neighborhoods in Caracas, he found a job with the city's transit system. He became a bus driver for the Caracas Metro, the subway system that had been built in the 1980s as Venezuela's oil money funded infrastructure projects. It was honest work, steady work, the kind of job that would allow him to support himself and eventually a family. Picture him in his early 20s, probably 1983 or 1984, putting on his uniform, climbing into the driver's seat of a metro bus, navigating the crowded streets of Caracas day after day. He would have interacted with hundreds of people, workers heading to their jobs, students going to school, elderly people running errands, the full spectrum of urban Venezuelan life passing through his bus. This was his education, in a way. This was where he learned about the concerns of ordinary Venezuelans, about their struggles to make ends meet, about their frustrations with the political system, about their dreams for something better. But Maduro wasn't content to simply drive buses and collect a paycheck. He had his father's activist spirit. He saw the transit workers as more than just individuals trying to earn a living. He saw them as a collective force, as workers who could organize, who could demand better treatment, better pay, better working conditions. He began to get involved with the Transit Workers Union, attending meetings, speaking up, making connections. He discovered that he had a talent for this kind of work, for bringing people together, for articulating their grievances, for standing up to management. In the early 1980s, he was one of the leaders of an effort to organize employees of the Caracas Metro Company. This was contentious work. The company didn't want unions. Management resisted. But Maduro and his fellow organizers persisted, and eventually, they succeeded in establishing the new Caracas Metro Workers Union, known by its Spanish acronym Citrameca. Maduro became a member of the board of directors. He was building a reputation as a focused and effective public speaker, as someone who could rally workers, who could negotiate with bosses, who could hold his own in the rough-and-tumble world of labor politics. But something else was happening in Venezuela during these years, something that would change Maduro's life forever. Revolutionary movements were stirring. Young military officers, frustrated with the corruption they saw in the civilian government, were beginning to organize. And far to the north, in Cuba, Fidel Castro's communist regime was looking for ways to spread its influence in Latin America, particularly in oil-rich Venezuela. In 1986, when Maduro was just 24 years old, he traveled to Cuba. He spent a full year there, receiving what was described as ideological instruction. This was his only formal education beyond high school, and it came not from a university but from the Cuban government's apparatus for training revolutionary activists. We don't know all the details of what this training involved, but we can make educated guesses. He would have studied Marxist theory, learned about revolutionary history, been exposed to the Cuban model of socialism, absorbed the rhetoric of anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism that Castro had been promoting for decades. When he returned to Venezuela in 1987, he was no longer just a union leader. He was a revolutionary, committed to transforming Venezuelan society, convinced that the Punto Fijo system had to be torn down and replaced with something fundamentally different. Venezuelan intelligence agencies took notice. They identified him as a leftist radical with close ties to the Cuban government. They were watching him. But they didn't stop him, perhaps because he seemed like just another young firebrand in a country full of discontented youth, someone making noise but not really threatening the established order. They underestimated him. They underestimated what was coming. It's worth pausing here to imagine what Maduro's daily life was like in these years. He was working full-time as a bus driver, doing shift work, probably irregular hours, dealing with traffic and difficult passengers and the wear and tear of navigating a city that was getting more congested and more chaotic by the year. In his off hours, he was organizing union activities, attending political meetings, connecting with other leftist activists who shared his vision of revolutionary change. He was also building a personal life. He had married his first wife, Adriana Guerra Angulo, and they had a son together, Nicolás Ernesto Maduro Guerra, who was born on June 21, 1990. Little Nicolásito, as he would be called, would grow up to follow his father into politics, though the circumstances of his parents' separation remained somewhat unclear. Maduro was juggling all of these responsibilities when, in 1992, everything changed. Not for him personally, not yet, but for Venezuela. On February 4 of that year, a group of young military officers launched a coup attempt against the government of President Carlos Andrés Pérez. The coup was led by Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chávez Frias, a charismatic paratrooper who commanded significant loyalty among junior officers and enlisted men. Chávez's plan was ambitious: take control of military bases and communication facilities across the country, capture the president, install a new government that would dismantle the corrupt Punto Fijo system and implement real socialist reforms. The coup failed. Through a combination of poor coordination, bad luck, and resistance from military units that remained loyal to the constitutional government, the rebellion collapsed. By the morning of February 5, Chávez and his co-conspirators were in custody. But before he was led away to prison, Chávez was given 1 minute to speak on national television, to urge his comrades who were still fighting to lay down their arms and surrender. What he said in that brief television appearance would make him a national figure overnight. He accepted responsibility for the coup's failure. He told his fellow conspirators that their objectives had not been achieved, por ahora, for now. Those two words, for now, electrified millions of Venezuelans. They suggested that this wasn't over, that the movement would continue, that eventually, they would succeed. The man speaking wasn't making excuses or blaming others. He was taking ownership, projecting strength even in defeat, promising that this was just the beginning. Nicolás Maduro saw that broadcast. Like millions of other Venezuelans who were frustrated with the status quo, he was captivated by Chávez. Here was someone from within the military establishment who was willing to risk everything to challenge the system. Here was someone who spoke the language of revolution, who invoked Simón Bolívar, Venezuela's greatest hero, who promised to fight for the poor and the forgotten. Maduro immediately joined the movement to support Chávez, to campaign for his release from prison, to keep the revolutionary flame alive while its leader sat behind bars. This was the moment that changed Nicolás Maduro's life forever. This was when he stopped being just a bus driver and union organizer and became a political revolutionary. This was when he met the man who would become his mentor, his patron, his route to power. And all of it began with a failed coup, with a moment on television that lasted less than 60 seconds, with 2 words spoken by an imprisoned officer who refused to give up. Before we follow Maduro's journey deeper into politics, we need to understand what led up to that February morning in 1992, because the Chávez coup didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of growing frustration, of mounting economic problems, of a political system that seemed incapable of reforming itself. And the story starts with something called the Caracazo, the Caracas smash, a week of riots that would shake Venezuela to its core and set the stage for everything that followed. Carlos Andrés Pérez had been elected president in 1988 on a wave of nostalgia. He had previously served as president from 1974 to 1979, during the glory days of the oil boom, when money flowed and Venezuela seemed unstoppable. Voters remembered those good times and hoped he could bring them back. But when Pérez took office in February 1989, he faced an economic disaster. Venezuela was deeply in debt. Oil prices had crashed. The economy was contracting. Inflation was accelerating. The International Monetary Fund came calling with demands for austerity measures in exchange for loans. Pérez, despite having campaigned against IMF policies, agreed to implement what was called a structural adjustment program. In plain terms, this meant cutting government subsidies, privatizing state-owned companies, eliminating price controls, and letting the currency float. The idea was to shock the economy into efficiency, to force it to modernize and diversify away from oil dependence. On paper, economists argued this would be better in the long run. In practice, it meant immediate pain for Venezuela's poorest citizens. On February 27, 1989, the government announced an increase in gasoline prices and bus fares. In a country that had long enjoyed some of the world's cheapest gas, this was seen as a betrayal. Commuters in Caracas woke up to find their transportation costs had effectively doubled overnight. Protests began in the poor neighborhoods, spreading quickly across the city and into other urban centers. What started as demonstrations against bus fare increases exploded into a general riot. People poured into the streets, looting stores, attacking government buildings, expressing years of pent-up rage at a system that had promised prosperity but delivered poverty. President Pérez declared a state of emergency and ordered the military to restore order. What happened next was brutal. Security forces and military units fired on crowds. The official death toll was around 275 people. But Venezuelan media sources and human rights organizations estimated that the true number was much higher, perhaps over 3,000. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Neighborhoods looked like war zones. The violence lasted for days before the military finally managed to suppress the uprising. The Caracazo shattered Venezuela's self-image as a stable, prosperous democracy. It exposed the rage simmering beneath the surface, the deep resentment of the poor toward the elite, the willingness of the government to use lethal force against its own citizens. For many Venezuelans, especially in the military, it was a turning point. How could they be ordered to shoot their own people? How could a government that claimed to be democratic massacre hundreds or thousands of citizens who were simply protesting economic policies that made their lives harder? Among the military officers watching these events unfold was Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chávez. He later claimed that his unit was not involved in the crackdown, that he was actually hospitalized with chickenpox during the worst of the violence. But whether or not he participated, he was deeply affected by what he saw. He called the Caracazo a genocide. He became convinced that the Punto Fijo system was beyond reform, that only a complete rupture, a revolutionary transformation, could save Venezuela. Chávez had actually founded his conspiratorial movement years earlier, in 1982. Along with a few other young officers, including Francisco Arias Cardenas, he had established the Movimiento Bolivariano Revolucionario 200, the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 200, named in honor of Simon Bolívar's 200th birthday. They met in secret, recruited carefully, and planned for the day when they would strike against the government. The Caracazo convinced them that the time had come. The coup was originally planned for December 1991, but Chávez kept delaying it, wanting to ensure better coordination, wanting to recruit more units, wanting to be certain they could succeed. Finally, in the early hours of February 4, 1992, they moved. Units loyal to Chávez attacked the presidential palace, Miraflores, trying to capture Pérez. Other units seized control of military bases in Maracaibo, Valencia, and other cities. The plan was to take over communications facilities, broadcast a message to the nation calling for popular support, and present the country with a fait accompli. But the plan fell apart. Pérez wasn't at Miraflores when the attack began. He managed to escape and rally loyal military units. The rebels failed to capture key communication installations, so they couldn't broadcast their message. Their coordination broke down. By dawn, it was clear the coup had failed. Chávez, commanding forces in Caracas, made the decision to surrender rather than continue fighting and causing more bloodshed. The casualties were significant. 18 soldiers were killed, with 51 wounded. But the majority of the deaths were civilians caught in the crossfire, 49 killed and about 80 injured. Despite the failure, despite the bloodshed, many poor Venezuelans saw Chávez as a hero. He had stood up to the corrupt government. He had been willing to risk his life for change. When he appeared on television to urge his comrades to surrender, his bearing, his words, his refusal to make excuses resonated with millions who felt the system had failed them. Chávez was imprisoned at the San Carlos military stockade. 9 months later, on November 27, 1992, another coup attempt was launched by officers loyal to Chávez's movement. This one was led by Air Force and Navy personnel, including pilot Luis Reyes. They had learned from the February coup's mistakes, launching their attack in the early morning hours, ensuring they had better communication equipment. They managed to take over the state television station and broadcast a video message from Chávez urging Venezuelans to support the rebellion. But this coup also failed. Government forces retook the military bases. The rebels who had captured the TV station eventually fled to Peru. The death toll was even higher this time, 172 people killed in the fighting. President Pérez's government survived, but it was mortally wounded politically. The coups had exposed how fragile Venezuela's democracy really was, how little loyalty the military felt toward the civilian government, how desperate many Venezuelans were for change. Nicolás Maduro watched all of this unfold from his position as a bus driver and union organizer in Caracas. The moment he saw Chávez on television in February, he knew he had found his leader. This was someone who spoke the language of revolution that Maduro had learned in Cuba. This was someone who promised to destroy the corrupt Punto Fijo system and build something new. Maduro joined the movement to free Chávez, working alongside other activists, including a young lawyer named Cilia Flores who would eventually become his second wife. The campaign for Chávez's release became Maduro's political education. He learned how to organize rallies, how to work with media, how to build grassroots networks of supporters. He connected with other left-wing activists from across Venezuela and Latin America. He positioned himself as one of Chávez's most loyal supporters, someone who believed in the revolution completely, someone who would do whatever it took to bring about the transformation they all dreamed of. In 1994, everything changed again. Rafael Caldera, who had previously served as president from 1969 to 1974, won the election on a platform that included pardoning the coup plotters. Caldera had actually defended the 1992 rebellions in a famous speech where he argued that while he couldn't condone the violence, he understood the frustrations that had driven those young officers to act. When he became president in early 1994, he kept his promise. Chávez and his co-conspirators were released from prison. Hugo Chávez emerged from 2 years of imprisonment as a national figure. He had spent his time behind bars reading, studying, refining his political philosophy, writing letters to supporters. Now he was free to speak publicly, to travel, to build a political movement openly rather than conspiratorially. He founded a new political party, the Fifth Republic Movement, Movimiento Quinta República, or MVR. The name invoked Simón Bolívar's vision of a Fifth Republic that would replace the failed Punto Fijo system. Nicolás Maduro was right there beside him. By this point, Maduro had left his job as a bus driver and was working full-time as a political organizer. He had proven his loyalty during Chávez's imprisonment. He had the connections in the labor movement. He understood how to mobilize working-class Venezuelans. Chávez trusted him, valued him, brought him into the inner circle of the movement. From 1994 to 1998, Chávez and his supporters, including Maduro, traveled across Venezuela building support for what they called the Bolivarian Revolution. They held rallies in small towns and in the barrios of major cities. They spoke to workers, to farmers, to students, to anyone who felt left behind by the existing system. Chávez was a magnetic speaker, able to connect with crowds, to make people believe that change was possible, that Venezuela could be reborn as a more just and equal society. They faced significant opposition. The traditional political parties, Democratic Action and COPE, dismissed Chávez as a coup-plotting strongman, as someone who couldn't be trusted with power. The media, largely owned by wealthy Venezuelans who benefited from the status quo, attacked him constantly. The business community feared his talk of expropriations and wealth redistribution. But none of that mattered to the millions of Venezuelans who had given up on the system, who saw in Chávez their last hope for real change. The presidential election of 1998 was a watershed moment. Chávez campaigned on a platform of convening a constituent assembly to write a new constitution, eliminating government corruption, and implementing programs to help the poor. He promised to challenge U.S. dominance in Latin America, to break Venezuela's dependence on international financial institutions, to use the country's oil wealth for the benefit of all Venezuelans rather than just the elite. His main opponent was Enrique Salas Roma, a Yale-educated businessman who represented the traditional political establishment. On December 6, 1998, Hugo Chávez won the presidency with 56.2% of the vote. It was a landslide victory, a clear mandate for revolutionary change. When he was inaugurated on February 2, 1999, he deviated from the traditional oath of office, swearing to drive forth the necessary democratic transformations so that the new republic would have a constitution befitting these new times. He was declaring war on the old system, making it clear that he intended to remake Venezuela from the ground up. Nicolás Maduro's role in all of this was crucial but largely behind the scenes. While Chávez was the charismatic leader giving speeches and dominating headlines, Maduro was doing the unglamorous work of political organizing, helping to build a party structure, managing relationships with allied groups, ensuring that the movement stayed unified and focused. In 1999, he was elected to the National Constituent Assembly, the body that Chávez had convened to draft a new constitution. This was Maduro's first formal political office, and he threw himself into the work, helping to shape the document that would govern Venezuela for the next quarter-century. The new constitution, ratified by voters in December 1999, dramatically expanded presidential powers. It extended the presidential term from 5 to 6 years and allowed immediate re-election, meaning a president could potentially serve 12 years instead of being limited to a single term as under the old constitution. It created a new legislative structure, replacing the bicameral Congress with a unicameral National Assembly. It mandated increased spending on health and education. It enshrined the right of indigenous peoples to their traditional lands. It committed Venezuela to a more independent foreign policy, less aligned with the United States. Critics argued that the Constitution concentrated too much power in the presidency, that it weakened checks and balances, that it created the framework for authoritarian rule. Supporters countered that it democratized Venezuelan society, that it gave voice to groups that had been marginalized, that it created the tools necessary to challenge entrenched elite interests. Both arguments had merit, and time would prove the critics right about the dangers of concentrating power. In 2000, under the new constitution, fresh elections were held. Chávez won again, this time with 59.8% of the vote. Nicolás Maduro was elected to the National Assembly, winning a seat representing the Caracas area. He was 37 years old, and for the first time in his life, he had real political power, not just as an organizer or activist but as an elected official with a vote on national legislation. Over the next few years, Maduro rose steadily through the ranks of the Chávez government. From 2005 to 2006, he served as Speaker of the National Assembly, presiding over legislative sessions, managing the passage of bills, representing the Assembly in public forums. It was a prestigious position, one that put him in regular contact with Chávez and allowed him to demonstrate his loyalty and competence. In 2006, Chávez appointed Maduro as Minister of Foreign Affairs. This was a significant promotion, moving him from the legislative branch into the executive, making him responsible for Venezuela's relationships with other nations. It was also a role that suited Maduro's skills. He wasn't a brilliant thinker or a charismatic orator like Chávez, but he was diligent, loyal, and capable of managing complex diplomatic relationships. He traveled constantly, meeting with foreign leaders, representing Venezuela at international forums, working to build alliances with other left-wing governments in Latin America and with countries like Russia, China, and Iran that shared Venezuela's antagonism toward U.S. influence. As foreign minister, Maduro was at the center of Venezuela's increasingly confrontational foreign policy. Chávez was positioning Venezuela as a leader of the anti-American bloc in Latin America, offering cheap oil to Cuba, forging alliances with Bolivia's Evo Morales and Ecuador's Rafael Correa, cozying up to Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Maduro facilitated all of this, negotiating agreements, signing treaties, defending Venezuela's positions in international forums. During this period, Maduro's personal life underwent significant changes. His first marriage had ended, though the details remained somewhat private. By the time he became foreign minister, he was in a relationship with Cilia Flores, the lawyer who had also been part of the movement to free Chávez from prison in the 1990s. Flores was not just Maduro's romantic partner but also his political partner, a shrewd operator who understood power and how to wield it. She had her own political career, serving as Attorney General from 2000 to 2004 and then as Speaker of the National Assembly from 2006 to 2011. When Maduro and Flores married, it created something like a political dynasty, two of Chávez's most trusted lieutenants joining their personal and professional lives. The Chávez years, from 1999 to 2013, were a period of dramatic transformation for Venezuela. Oil prices were rising globally, driven partly by growing demand from China and partly by instability in the Middle East. Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, was bringing in unprecedented revenue. Chávez used this money to fund social programs called missions, offering free healthcare through Cuban doctors, subsidized food through government stores, literacy programs, housing projects. For millions of poor Venezuelans, life genuinely improved during this period. They had access to services they'd never had before. They felt seen and valued by their government in a way they never had under the old system. But even as oil money flowed and social spending increased, warning signs were appearing. Chávez's government was becoming increasingly authoritarian. In 2007, when he tried to reform the constitution to eliminate presidential term limits and was rejected by voters, he simply resubmitted the proposal 2 years later and got it passed. Opposition media outlets were shut down or forced to moderate their coverage through regulatory pressure. Business owners who opposed the government faced expropriations of their property. Political opponents found themselves investigated, prosecuted, sometimes imprisoned on charges that seemed politically motivated. The economy was also showing strain. Despite all the oil revenue, Venezuela was importing more and more goods rather than producing them domestically. Agricultural production declined as the government focused on buying food abroad with petrodollars. Manufacturing shrank as the government's expropriations and currency controls scared away investment. Inflation began creeping upward. Shortages of basic goods became more common. The signs of future crisis were there for anyone willing to see them, but Chávez's popularity remained high among the poor, and opposition voices were increasingly marginalized. Maduro watched all of this from his position as foreign minister. He saw the successes, the genuine improvements in poor people's lives. But he also saw the problems, the way the government's policies were creating dependencies rather than sustainable development, the way political power was being concentrated, the way dissent was being suppressed. Did he have doubts? Did he worry about where it was all heading? If he did, he kept those concerns to himself. He remained absolutely loyal to Chávez, defending the government's every action, attacking its critics with rhetoric that grew increasingly harsh. In October 2012, Chávez appointed Maduro as vice president of Venezuela. This was an enormous promotion, moving him from cabinet minister to the president's number 2, making him next in line should anything happen to Chávez. At the time, it seemed like a standard political appointment, a reward for years of loyal service. But in retrospect, the timing is striking. Because just a few months earlier, Chávez had revealed something to the Venezuelan people that he had been keeping secret. He had cancer. Hugo Chávez had first been diagnosed with cancer in June 2011. He had traveled to Cuba for surgery to remove a tumor from his pelvic area. He announced the diagnosis to the nation, assuring Venezuelans that he would fight and beat the disease. Over the next year and a half, he underwent multiple surgeries, chemotherapy treatments, long periods of convalescence in Havana. The government was secretive about the exact nature of his cancer, what type it was, how advanced it had become. But it was clear that Chávez was seriously ill, that his robust physical presence was fading, that he was losing his battle. Despite his illness, Chávez ran for re-election in October 2012. His main opponent was Enrique Capriles Radonsky, the young governor of Miranda State who represented the opposition coalition. Chávez campaigned as much as his health allowed, giving speeches, appearing at rallies, projecting strength even as his body weakened. He won with 55.1% of the vote to Capriles's 44.3%. It was a narrower margin than his previous victories, suggesting that the opposition was gaining strength, but it was still decisive. Chávez's inauguration was scheduled for January 10, 2013. But as that date approached, it became clear he would not be able to attend. He was back in Cuba, too sick to travel, unable to perform the duties of his office. The National Assembly, led by the Chavista majority, decided to postpone the inauguration indefinitely, ruling that Chávez could be sworn in at a later date when his health improved. The opposition cried foul, arguing that the constitution required the inauguration to take place on the scheduled date, that if Chávez couldn't attend, the vice president should assume the presidency temporarily. But the Chavistas controlled all the levers of power: the National Assembly, the Supreme Court, the military, the state bureaucracy. They made the rules, and they decided that Chávez remained president even though he was unable to perform his duties, even though he was lying in a hospital bed in Havana barely conscious. Nicolás Maduro, as vice president, began acting as president in all but name, making decisions, giving speeches, representing the government. He traveled to Cuba repeatedly to visit Chávez, emerging from each visit to give vague updates about the president's improving health even as it became increasingly obvious that Chávez was dying. On February 18, 2013, the government released the first photos of Chávez since his latest surgery. The images showed him lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by family members, smiling weakly at the camera. He looked frail, his face swollen, his eyes tired. The photos were meant to reassure Venezuelans that their president was still alive, still fighting. Instead, they had the opposite effect, making it starkly clear how sick he really was. Exactly 1 month later, on March 5, 2013, at 4:25 p.m. local time, Vice President Nicolás Maduro appeared on state television with an announcement that would change Venezuela forever. Hugo Chávez had died. The Comandante, the leader of the Bolivarian Revolution, the man who had dominated Venezuelan politics for 14 years, was gone. He was 58 years old. The announcement sent shockwaves through Venezuela. Chavistas wept openly in the streets. Supporters gathered outside the military hospital where Chávez's body lay in state. State television played revolutionary music and showed images of Chávez from throughout his career. The government declared 9 days of national mourning. Latin American leaders began arriving in Caracas to pay their respects. The country that Chávez had transformed was now faced with the question of what would come next. Maduro, speaking through tears during his announcement, made something clear. He was positioning himself as Chávez's successor, as the one who would continue the revolution. In his announcement, he even suggested that Chávez's cancer might have been deliberately induced by enemies of the revolution, a conspiracy theory with no evidence that nevertheless planted seeds of paranoia and martyrdom. He portrayed Chávez not just as a leader who had died of a terrible disease but as a fighter who had been struck down by dark forces, making his death something sacred, something that demanded loyalty to his legacy. Under the Venezuelan constitution, when a president dies or leaves office, new elections must be held within 30 days. A special presidential election was scheduled for April 14, 2013. Maduro would run as the candidate of the United Socialist Party, the party Chávez had created by merging all the different pro-government factions. His opponent, once again, would be Enrique Capriles. The campaign was unlike any Venezuela had seen before. Maduro couldn't rely on his own charisma or oratory skills. He wasn't Chávez. He didn't have that magnetic personality, that ability to command a crowd's attention and affection. Instead, he ran as Chávez's chosen successor, as the man who would continue Chávez's work, as the faithful son carrying on his father's legacy. His campaign slogan was simple: "Chávez, I swear to you, my vote is for Maduro." He appeared at rallies with images of Chávez looming behind him. He claimed that Chávez had appeared to him as a little bird while he was praying, blessing his candidacy. He positioned himself not as a leader in his own right but as Chávez's spiritual heir. Capriles tried to run on issues, pointing out that Venezuela's economy was in trouble, that inflation was rising, that shortages were becoming more common, that the government's policies needed to change. But he was fighting against a wave of emotion. Millions of Chavistas were still mourning their leader. The government controlled state media and used it to campaign for Maduro around the clock. The state apparatus, from the military to the civil service to the PDVSA oil company, was mobilized to support Maduro's campaign. On election night, April 14th, the results came in close. Maduro won with 50.6% of the vote to Capriles's 49.1%. It was a margin of just 1.5 percentage points, about 235,000 votes out of more than 14.9 million cast. Capriles immediately cried foul, demanding a full recount, claiming that there had been irregularities, that Chavista operatives had intimidated opposition voters, that the government had manipulated the results. The opposition refused to recognize Maduro's victory. Protests erupted across Venezuela. Opposition supporters took to the streets, demanding that every vote be counted, that the election be audited. Violence broke out between opposition protesters and government supporters. Several people were killed in clashes. The National Electoral Council, which was controlled by Chavista appointees, agreed to audit a portion of the votes but declared that the audit confirmed Maduro's victory. International observers from organizations friendly to the Chavista government, like UNISA, endorsed the results. But many opposition leaders and Western governments remained skeptical. On April 19, 2013, Nicolás Maduro was inaugurated as president of Venezuela. He was 50 years old. He had gone from driving buses in the streets of Caracas to leading the country. But he was inheriting a poisoned chalice. The oil money that had funded Chávez's social programs was no longer flowing as freely. Oil prices were starting to decline from their peak. The Venezuelan economy, which had been distorted by years of price controls, currency manipulation, and government interventions, was already showing signs of serious trouble. The political opposition, emboldened by their narrow defeat, was determined to challenge him at every turn. And Maduro himself lacked the personal authority and popularity that Chávez had commanded. He was not the revolutionary leader. He was the man trying to fill revolutionary shoes that were several sizes too large. The first years of Maduro's presidency were defined by his attempts to consolidate power and his struggles against mounting economic problems. Unlike Chávez, who had come to power with a clear vision and tremendous popular support, Maduro was operating in Chávez's shadow, always trying to prove that he was worthy of his predecessor's legacy. This created a kind of insecurity that shaped his approach to governance. One of his first major actions was to crack down on the opposition. In 2014, massive protests swept through Venezuela, beginning in the western city of San Cristobal and spreading to Caracas and other major cities. The protesters were a mix of students, middle-class Venezuelans frustrated with the economy, and opposition supporters who believed Maduro's election had been fraudulent. They demanded the release of political prisoners, an end to the government's crackdown on media, and solutions to the growing problems of crime, inflation, and shortages. Maduro responded with force. He deployed the National Guard, the National Police, and armed pro-government militias called colectivos to suppress the protests. Tear gas filled the streets of Caracas. Rubber bullets and buckshot injured hundreds. Protesters were arrested by the thousands. Opposition leaders were imprisoned or forced into exile. Leopoldo López, one of the most prominent opposition figures, surrendered to authorities and was sentenced to nearly 14 years in prison for allegedly inciting violence, a charge that human rights organizations condemned as politically motivated. The 2014 protests lasted for months, from February through June. When they finally subsided, 43 people had been killed, hundreds more injured, thousands arrested. The government blamed the violence on fascist opponents backed by the United States. The opposition blamed the government's brutal repression. International human rights organizations documented abuses by both security forces and pro-government militias, finding that the government had systematically violated the rights of protesters, journalists, and opposition political leaders. But Maduro didn't just crack down on the streets. He also moved to consolidate control over Venezuela's institutions. He appointed loyalists to key positions in the judiciary, ensuring that the Supreme Court would rule in his favor on any constitutional disputes. He purged the military of officers whose loyalty was questionable, promoting those who demonstrated absolute allegiance to the government. He expanded the use of emergency decrees that allowed him to bypass the National Assembly and govern by executive order. In 2015, Venezuela held National Assembly elections. This was supposed to be a routine legislative vote, but it turned into a referendum on Maduro's presidency. The economic situation was worsening. Inflation was accelerating. Shortages of basic goods from toilet paper to flour were becoming severe. Long lines formed outside supermarkets whenever rumors spread that a shipment had arrived. Voters were angry and scared, and they took it out on the government. The opposition won a stunning victory, capturing 112 seats in the 167-member National Assembly, a supermajority that gave them the power to block Maduro's appointments, initiate referendums, and even begin proceedings to remove the president from office. It was the first time since Chávez came to power in 1999 that the opposition had controlled any branch of government. For a brief moment, it seemed like Venezuela might be heading toward democratic change, toward a peaceful transition away from Chavismo. Maduro and the Chavista establishment were not about to let that happen. Rather than accept the voters' verdict and work with the opposition-controlled assembly, they moved to neuter it. The Supreme Court, packed with government loyalists, began ruling that virtually every law passed by the opposition assembly was unconstitutional. The court even ruled that the assembly itself was in contempt because of a dispute over the seating of a few members from the state of Amazonas, and therefore all of its actions were null and void. This created a constitutional crisis. Venezuela had a legislative body elected by the people, but a judicial body appointed by the government was declaring everything it did to be invalid. The opposition called it a coup against the legislature. The government claimed it was defending the constitution. International organizations condemned the court's actions as a power grab. But without any mechanism to enforce checks and balances, without any institution willing to challenge the government, there was nothing anyone could do. In 2017, Maduro took the final step in dismantling Venezuela's democratic institutions. He convened a constituent assembly, ostensibly to rewrite the constitution, but in practice to create a parallel legislature that would be under government control. The election for this constituent assembly was widely seen as fraudulent. The opposition boycotted it. Turnout figures were almost certainly inflated. The voting process was opaque. But the government went ahead anyway, creating a 545-member body composed entirely of Chavistas, and declaring that this new assembly had supreme power over all other institutions, including the elected National Assembly. Venezuela now had two legislative bodies. One elected by the people in free and fair elections in 2015, with an opposition majority, and one created by the government through a rigged process in 2017, with a Chavista supermajority. The government recognized only the second one. The opposition and most of the international community recognized only the first. It was absurd. It was clearly authoritarian. But Maduro didn't care. He had the military. He had the security forces. He had the state apparatus. He could do whatever he wanted, and there was no one powerful enough to stop him. The protests against the Constituent Assembly in 2017 were even larger and more violent than the 2014 demonstrations. For nearly 4 months, from April to July, Venezuela was in a state of near chaos. Protesters built barricades in the streets. They clashed with security forces and collectivos. They set fire to government buildings. The government responded with increasing brutality, deploying armored vehicles, using live ammunition, arresting thousands. By the time the protests finally ended in late July 2017, at least 125 people had been killed. Most were protesters, but some were security forces or government supporters. Thousands more had been injured. More than 5,000 people had been arrested, many of them held without trial for months or years. Human rights organizations documented systematic use of torture against detainees. Opposition leaders were hunted down. Many fled into exile. Others went into hiding or were given refuge in foreign embassies. One of the most shocking incidents occurred in June 2017, when a police officer named Oscar Perez stole a helicopter and attacked the Supreme Court building and the Interior Ministry with grenades and gunfire. No one was seriously injured in the attack, but it was a dramatic demonstration of how deeply opposition to Maduro had spread, even within the security forces. Perez went into hiding and released videos calling for an uprising against the government. He evaded capture for months until January 2018, when security forces cornered him and his small group of supporters in a house outside Caracas. The subsequent firefight left Perez and several others dead. The government claimed they had died in combat. Witnesses and forensic evidence suggested they had been executed after surrendering. Through all of this violence, all of this political maneuvering, the Venezuelan economy was collapsing in slow motion, and then not so slowly. To understand what happened to Venezuela's economy under Maduro, and why it's important to the story of his eventual downfall, we need to understand how the country's economy had worked, or failed to work, for decades. Venezuela had been a petrostate since the 1920s, when oil was first discovered there in commercial quantities. By the mid-20th century, oil exports made up the vast majority of government revenue and nearly all of the country's export earnings. This created what economists call Dutch disease, named after what happened to the Netherlands when it discovered natural gas. When a country has a hugely profitable export commodity like oil, the money flowing in causes the currency to appreciate, which makes all other exports more expensive and less competitive. Meanwhile, it becomes cheaper to import goods than to produce them domestically, so manufacturing and agriculture decline. The country becomes dependent on the one commodity, and when the price of that commodity falls, the entire economy crashes. Venezuela had experienced this cycle before. In the 1980s, when oil prices collapsed, Venezuela went from boom to bust almost overnight. But the country had always recovered when prices rose again. The Chavez years coincided with rising oil prices globally, which allowed him to fund his social programs without making painful economic reforms. He didn't diversify the economy. He didn't build up manufacturing or agriculture. He just spent the oil money on his missions and imported everything else. When Maduro took over in 2013, oil prices were still reasonably high, around $100 per barrel. But they were starting to fall. By mid-2014, they had dropped to around $90. By early 2015, they were below $60. By early 2016, they had crashed to around $30. For a country that derived more than 90% of its export earnings from oil, this was catastrophic. A prudent government would have adjusted its spending, cut back on programs, raised taxes, worked to increase non-oil economic activity. Instead, Maduro's government tried to spend its way through the crisis. Rather than admit the problem and make tough choices, they just kept spending, kept subsidizing food and fuel, kept printing money to cover the gap between revenue and expenses. The result was entirely predictable. Hyperinflation. Inflation in Venezuela had been a problem for decades, but it was manageable, usually in the double digits per year. Under Maduro, it spiraled completely out of control. In 2013, inflation was about 40%. In 2014, it rose to 62%. In 2015, 121%. In 2016, 254%. And then it went truly insane. In 2017, inflation hit 1,087%. In 2018, It reached an almost incomprehensible 65,374%. At its peak in 2019, Venezuela's inflation rate was estimated at around 10 million%, one of the highest rates ever recorded in human history, comparable only to places like Zimbabwe, the Weimar Republic, or Hungary after World War II. What does hyperinflation look like in practice? It means that money becomes worthless. A bolivar that could buy you a cup of coffee in the morning can't buy you anything by the afternoon. Prices change by the hour. Store owners can't keep up with repricing their inventory. People rush to spend money as soon as they receive it because tomorrow it will be worth less. Savings are wiped out. Anyone living on a fixed income, retirees, people with disabilities, becomes destitute almost overnight. The government tried to cope by instituting strict currency controls. They fixed the official exchange rate at an artificially low level, trying to pretend that the bolivar was worth more than it actually was. But this just created a massive black market where bolivars traded at hundreds or thousands of times the official rate. The government also instituted price controls, declaring that certain basic goods could only be sold at specific prices. But with hyperinflation raging, those controlled prices were often below what it cost to produce or import the goods, so businesses stopped selling them. Shortages became endemic. By 2016 and 2017, Venezuela was experiencing humanitarian crisis. Supermarkets were empty. People were going hungry. Malnutrition rates, especially among children, soared. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines and supplies. Patients died from treatable conditions because there were no antibiotics, no fluids, no anesthesia for surgery. Crime exploded as desperate people resorted to violence to survive. Caracas became one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Refugees began flooding across Venezuela's borders into Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, anywhere they could go to escape the catastrophe. The government's response to all of this was denial and repression. Maduro blamed the shortages on an economic war being waged by the opposition, by businesses, by the United States. He claimed that the problems were caused by hoarding and speculation, by enemies trying to sabotage the revolution. He created a system of government-controlled distribution centers called CLAPs, local committees for supply and production, that were supposed to provide subsidized food directly to neighborhoods. But the CLAP system became a tool for political control. Only government supporters received food boxes. Opposition neighborhoods were punished with reduced or no deliveries. And even for those who received the boxes, the food inside was often of poor quality, sometimes rotten, and never enough to meet basic nutritional needs. In August 2018, Maduro's government attempted a bizarre solution to the hyperinflation. They announced a currency redenomination, lopping 5 zeros off the bolivar and creating the Bolivar Soberano, the sovereign bolivar. 1 Bolivar Soberano was equal to 100,000 old bolivars. At the same time, they increased the minimum wage by 3,000% and pegged the currency to the petro, a cryptocurrency that the government had created and that almost no one actually used. The redenomination was a disaster. Businesses couldn't keep up with the changes. Payment systems crashed. The new currency notes weren't available in sufficient quantities. And most importantly, the underlying problems, the government's overspending, the lack of productive economic activity, the currency printing to cover budget gaps, hadn't been addressed. Within weeks, inflation was roaring again. Within months, the Bolivar Soberano had lost most of its value. By 2019, they had to redenominate again, this time creating the Bolivar Digital and removing 6 more zeros. The scale of Venezuela's economic collapse under Maduro is difficult to overstate. Between 2013 and 2020, Venezuela's GDP, its gross domestic product, the total value of everything the country produced, shrank by about 75%. This is a contraction larger than what the United States experienced during the Great Depression. It's comparable to what happened to the Soviet Union when it collapsed, or to Syria during its civil war. A country that had been one of the wealthiest in Latin America became one of the poorest, all in the span of less than a decade. The human cost was staggering. More than 7 million Venezuelans, out of a pre-crisis population of around 30 million, fled the country between 2014 and 2024. They walked across the Colombian border with whatever they could carry. They made their way to Peru, to Chile, to Argentina, to the United States. They became refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, whatever term you want to use. They left behind homes, jobs, families, entire lives, because staying in Venezuela meant watching their children go hungry, meant having no access to medicine when they got sick, meant facing violence in the streets and political repression from the government. The crisis affected different Venezuelans in different ways. The wealthy, those with connections abroad or access to foreign currency, could leave or could shelter themselves from the worst effects. They moved money out of the country. They left for Miami or Madrid. The professional class, doctors, engineers, teachers, also left in large numbers, creating a brain drain that further damaged the economy. But the poor, the people who lived in the barrios, the people who had been Chávez's strongest supporters, they were trapped. They couldn't afford to leave. They didn't have the papers or the money to emigrate. They had to stay and survive however they could. Some of them turned against Maduro, blaming him for the disaster. Others clung to the government, accepting the narrative that external enemies were responsible, receiving their clapboxes and government handouts and hoping things would eventually improve. The tragedy was that the very people the Bolivarian Revolution had promised to help ended up suffering the most when it all fell apart. Maduro could have responded to the crisis by changing course, by implementing economic reforms, by reaching out to the opposition and the international community for help. Instead, he doubled down. He blamed everyone but himself. He arrested more political opponents. He tightened his grip on power. And he turned increasingly to authoritarian allies and criminal networks to keep his government afloat. By the late 2010s, Venezuela's government had effectively become a criminal enterprise. This isn't hyperbole. It's what US prosecutors and international investigators found when they looked closely at how the Maduro regime operated. The government was involved in narco-trafficking on a massive scale, allowing Colombian guerrilla groups and drug cartels to use Venezuelan territory to move cocaine. High-ranking military and government officials were taking bribes and cuts from drug shipments. The United States indicted Maduro himself in March 2020 on charges of narco-terrorism, offering a $15 million reward for information leading to his capture. The indictment painted a picture of a government that had partnered with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, and its successor groups to facilitate cocaine trafficking. According to US prosecutors, Maduro and his associates helped the FARC transport cocaine from Colombia through Venezuela to the Caribbean and on to the United States. They provided safe haven for FARC leaders. They used Venezuelan military and intelligence assets to support trafficking operations. And they made billions of dollars in the process, money that went into personal accounts rather than helping the Venezuelan people. Other schemes emerged as well. The government was accused of gold smuggling, exploiting Venezuela's mineral wealth by partnering with criminal syndicates to mine and export gold illegally. They were accused of money laundering on a vast scale, using state institutions to hide the proceeds of criminal activity. Even the humanitarian aid that Venezuela received from international donors often disappeared into black markets or was diverted to government loyalists. This criminalization of the state happened gradually, but it was also inevitable given the government's trajectory. As the economy collapsed and legitimate sources of revenue dried up, Maduro's regime needed alternative funding sources. Illegal activities provided that funding. And once government officials started taking drug money, once military officers became involved in trafficking, the regime became dependent on criminal enterprises to survive. This created what's sometimes called a narco-state, where the line between government and criminal organization disappears completely. The international community watched all of this with a mixture of horror and frustration. From 2014 onward, the United States imposed increasingly strict sanctions on Venezuela, targeting individuals in Maduro's government, then sectors of the economy, eventually the oil industry itself. The European Union imposed its own sanctions. The Organization of American States condemned Maduro's actions. The Lima Group, a coalition of Latin American nations, refused to recognize his government as legitimate. But sanctions had limited effect. They hurt the Venezuelan economy, making the humanitarian crisis worse for ordinary people while leaving the regime intact. Maduro responded to sanctions by becoming even more dependent on authoritarian allies. Russia provided financial support, military equipment, and political backing. China extended credit lines, though it became more cautious as Venezuela's ability to repay debts deteriorated. Iran sent fuel shipments when Venezuela's own refineries broke down. Cuba continued to receive cheap Venezuelan oil in exchange for medical personnel and intelligence advisors. Turkey became particularly important to the Maduro regime. Venezuela sold gold to Turkey, providing the regime with hard currency that wasn't subject to U.S. sanctions. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan developed a close relationship with Maduro, visiting Caracas and hosting Maduro in Ankara. These relationships helped Maduro survive, but at a cost. Venezuela was mortgaging its future, selling off assets, accumulating debts, and becoming increasingly isolated from the democratic world. Through all these years of economic collapse, political repression, and international isolation, Nicolás Maduro held on to power through a combination of tactics. He controlled the military by promoting loyalists and purging potential threats. He bought off key supporters with access to scarce resources, foreign currency, government contracts. He used repression to frighten potential opponents, sending a message that challenging the government could cost you your freedom or your life. And he manipulated elections to create a veneer of legitimacy while ensuring outcomes that kept him in power. The 2018 presidential election was a perfect example. It was originally scheduled for December 2018, but Maduro moved it up to May, catching the opposition off guard. The main opposition parties boycotted the election, arguing that it couldn't be free and fair under existing conditions. The government banned the most popular opposition leaders from running. International observers from credible organizations weren't allowed to monitor the vote. The conditions were so flawed that the United States, the European Union, and most Latin American nations refused to recognize the results. Maduro won with 67.8% of the vote, but turnout was only about 46%, the lowest in any Venezuelan election since 1958. Millions of Venezuelans simply didn't vote, either because they were disillusioned, because they had fled the country, or because they were boycotting what they saw as a sham election. The government claimed victory. The opposition called it fraudulent. And the standoff continued. In January 2019, when Maduro was inaugurated for his second term, something unprecedented happened. Juan Guaido, the president of the opposition-controlled National Assembly, declared himself interim president of Venezuela. His argument was that because Maduro's 2018 election was illegitimate, the presidency was vacant, and under the constitution, the president of the National Assembly should assume the role until new elections could be held. This was a dramatic escalation. For the first time since the Chavez era began, there were two people claiming to be Venezuela's president. Maduro had control of all the government institutions, the military, the security forces, the state apparatus. But Guaido had something Maduro lacked: international recognition. Within days, more than 50 countries, including the United States and most of Latin America and Europe, recognized Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president. They began treating him as the head of state, giving him access to Venezuelan assets held abroad, coordinating their policies with his team. For several months in early 2019, it seemed like change might be coming. Large crowds turned out to support Guaido at rallies across Venezuela. There were rumors that military units might defect to his side. The United States applied intense pressure on the Maduro government, with officials openly discussing military intervention as an option. Humanitarian aid was staged at the Colombian border, ready to enter Venezuela if the blockade could be broken. But it didn't work. The military stayed loyal to Maduro, or at least didn't openly defect. The promised uprising never materialized. An attempt to deliver humanitarian aid across the Colombian border in February 2019 turned into a chaotic mess, with Venezuelan forces firing tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters. An attempted military uprising in April 2019 fizzled out when the key military leaders Guaido had been counting on didn't follow through. By mid-2019, the momentum had shifted back to Maduro. He had survived the most serious challenge to his rule. Guaido remained in Venezuela, still claiming to be interim president, still recognized by many countries, but increasingly irrelevant inside the country where Maduro controlled all the levers of power. The opposition was divided between those who wanted to continue supporting Guaido and those who thought it was time to try different tactics. The international community, which had hoped for a quick transition, resigned itself to the reality that Maduro wasn't going anywhere soon. The years 2019 through 2023 settled into a grim pattern. The economy remained in shambles, though hyperinflation gradually slowed as the government allowed more dollarization, letting people use US currency for transactions. This helped stabilize things somewhat, but it also meant the government had essentially lost control of its own monetary policy. Shortages remained chronic. Power outages became routine as the electrical grid, starved of maintenance and investment, deteriorated. Running water was intermittent in many areas. The healthcare system had basically collapsed. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Venezuela hard in 2020 and 2021, but accurate statistics were impossible to obtain because the government stopped reporting reliable data. Through all of this, Maduro stayed in power. He survived not because he was popular, but because he controlled the institutions that mattered. The military remained mostly loyal, kept in line through a combination of privileges for senior officers and fear of what might happen if the regime fell. The SEBIN, the Bolivarian Intelligence Service, and other security agencies maintained a climate of fear, monitoring citizens, infiltrating opposition groups, making arrests when necessary. The colectivos, armed pro-government militias, provided muscle on the streets, intimidating opponents and attacking protesters when needed. But as the 2024 presidential election approached, something shifted in Venezuela. The opposition, which had been fragmented and demoralized after the failure of the Guaido interim presidency, began to coalesce around a new strategy and new leadership. And this would lead directly to the events that brought about Maduro's downfall. The key figure in this transformation was Maria Corina Machado. Born in 1967 into a wealthy Venezuelan family, Machado had founded a civil society organization in the 1990s and had been involved in opposition politics for years. She had served in the National Assembly from 2011 to 2014, where she became known as one of the most vocal and uncompromising critics of the Chavista government. She had participated in the 2014 protests and had faced government harassment as a result. But she had never run for president before. She had been waiting for the right moment. That moment came in 2023, when the opposition decided to hold primaries to select a unified presidential candidate. Machado entered the race and won decisively, receiving about 93% of the vote in the October 2023 primary. More than 2 million Venezuelans participated, a remarkable turnout given the challenges of organizing an opposition primary in an authoritarian state. Machado's victory showed that the opposition base wanted someone tough, someone who wouldn't compromise with the regime, someone who would fight. But Maduro's government wasn't about to let Machado threaten their hold on power. In January 2024, Venezuela's government-controlled Controller General disqualified Machado from running for office, claiming she had accepted foreign financing and had supported sanctions against Venezuela. Under Venezuelan law, these were grounds for being barred from holding public office. The decision was clearly political. It was designed to prevent Machado, the opposition's strongest candidate, from appearing on the ballot. The opposition faced a choice: accept the disqualification and find another candidate, or refuse to participate in what would obviously be a rigged election. They chose a middle path. Machado would remain as the symbolic leader of the opposition, campaigning across the country, giving speeches, rallying supporters. But they would field a stand-in candidate, someone who could appear on the ballot while everyone understood that a vote for him was really a vote for the movement Machado led. That stand-in was Edmundo González Urrutia, a 74-year-old former diplomat with a mild manner and a technocratic background. González had served as Venezuela's ambassador to Argentina and Algeria in the pre-Chavez era. He had stayed out of politics for years, working as an academic and international relations consultant. He wasn't a firebrand like Machado. He wasn't particularly charismatic. But he was acceptable to a broad range of opposition factions, and most importantly, the government hadn't disqualified him. The campaign leading up to the July 28, 2024 election was unlike any Venezuela had seen in years. Machado and González traveled together across the country, drawing massive crowds. In some cities, hundreds of thousands of people turned out to see them, numbers that dwarfed anything Maduro could muster at his own rallies. The opposition was energized in a way they hadn't been since the early days of the Guaido interim presidency. People who had given up on politics, who had accepted that Maduro would rule forever, started to believe that change might be possible. The government tried every trick to stop them. They denied the opposition access to state media. They blocked roads to prevent people from attending rallies. They arrested campaign workers. They intimidated people, warning them that if they attended opposition events, they might lose their government jobs or their clap food boxes. Machado herself was repeatedly detained and harassed by security forces, though they never actually arrested her, perhaps fearing that making her a political prisoner would only increase her popularity. As election day approached, independent polls showed González with a commanding lead, often by margins of 20 or 30 percentage points. Even polls conducted by firms close to the government showed the opposition ahead. It seemed clear that if the election were fair, the opposition would win decisively. But no one believed the election would be fair. The question was whether the government would dare to commit fraud on a scale so large, so obvious, that it would spark a crisis. On July 28, 2024, Venezuelans went to the polls. Turnout was heavy. Lines formed early in the morning at voting centers across the country. Opposition supporters wore white, the color of their campaign. Government supporters wore red, the color of Chavismo. The atmosphere was tense but peaceful. International observers from various organizations were present, though the government had denied access to observers from the European Union and OAS, allowing only those from friendly nations. As the day went on, reports started trickling in. Voting machines were malfunctioning. Some polling places were closing early. In opposition strongholds, security forces were present in heavy numbers, intimidating voters. But people kept voting. Opposition representatives at each polling station carefully recorded vote counts, preparing to compare the official results with their own tallies. Then, at 11 p.m., just 5 hours after polls closed, the National Electoral Council made an announcement. Nicolás Maduro had won re-election with 51.2% of the vote to González's 44.2%. It was a narrow victory, closer than previous elections, but enough to give Maduro another 6-year term. The announcement was met with immediate skepticism. How could they have counted all the votes so quickly? Why were they releasing only percentages without showing the detailed results from individual polling stations? Where was the evidence? The opposition immediately cried foul. They had their own numbers, compiled from receipts that voting machines printed at each polling station. These receipts, called actas, showed the vote totals for that specific location. Opposition witnesses had collected these receipts from thousands of polling stations across the country. And when they tallied them up, they told a completely different story. According to the opposition's count, based on 83.5% of polling stations, González had won with about 67% of the vote to Maduro's 30%. It wasn't even close. The opposition published their data online, creating a website where anyone could view the scanned actas and verify the results for themselves. Independent analysts, including the Carter Center and other electoral observation organizations, examined the opposition's data and found it credible. The voting machine receipts appeared authentic. The chain of custody was documented, and the results matched what pre-election polls had predicted. Meanwhile, the government refused to release detailed results from individual polling stations, claiming their computer systems had been hacked, that they needed time to verify everything, that they would eventually provide the data. They never did. What followed was predictable. Protests erupted across Venezuela. In Caracas and cities throughout the country, people took to the streets demanding that the government recognize the true results. They chanted Libertad, freedom. They waved Venezuelan flags. They built barricades. Some tore down statues of Hugo Chavez, the symbolic act of rejecting everything the Bolivarian Revolution had claimed to represent. The government responded with overwhelming force. Security forces fired tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters. Live ammunition was used in some cases. The collectivos rode through neighborhoods on motorcycles, shooting at anyone they identified as an opposition supporter. Over the following days and weeks, more than 20 people were killed, according to human rights organizations. Thousands were arrested. Many detainees reported being tortured. The government claimed the protesters were terrorists trying to stage a coup backed by foreign powers. The international community reacted with near-unanimous condemnation. The United States refused to recognize Maduro's claimed victory. So did the European Union, Canada, and most Latin American nations. Only Venezuela's closest allies, Cuba, Nicaragua, Russia, China, Iran, acknowledged Maduro as the winner. Even some left-leaning Latin American governments that had previously been sympathetic to Chavismo, like Brazil and Colombia, expressed serious concerns about the electoral process. But once again, condemnation from abroad didn't change the situation on the ground. Maduro controlled the military and the security forces. He controlled the Supreme Court, which ruled that his victory was legitimate. He controlled the National Electoral Council, which refused to provide evidence to support its announced results. He controlled the television stations and newspapers that most Venezuelans relied on for information. And most importantly, he was willing to use violence to stay in power. Democratic principles, constitutional procedures, international law, none of it mattered. Only power mattered. Edmundo González Urrutia, the man who had almost certainly won the election, found himself in increasing danger. The government issued an arrest warrant for him, accusing him of conspiracy and usurpation of functions. He was effectively being threatened with imprisonment for having the audacity to run for president and claim he had won. Facing the prospect of arrest and likely torture, González made the difficult decision to flee Venezuela. In September 2024, he boarded a Spanish military plane and flew to exile in Madrid, where the Spanish government granted him asylum. Maria Corina Machado remained in Venezuela, but she was forced into hiding. The government wanted to arrest her too, but she was too popular, too visible internationally. Making her a political prisoner might spark even worse violence than they had already seen. So instead, they let her stay free but effectively silenced her, cutting off her access to media, preventing her from moving around the country freely, isolating her from her supporters. By late 2024, Maduro appeared to have survived yet again. He had stolen an election in broad daylight, crushed the protests that followed, driven the opposition leadership into exile or hiding, and maintained his grip on power. International condemnation didn't bother him. Sanctions were already as severe as they could be. He still had support from Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. He could keep going indefinitely, or so it seemed. But in November 2024, something changed in the United States. Donald Trump won the presidential election, defeating Kamala Harris and returning to the White House for a second term. Trump had always taken a harder line on Venezuela than most other U.S. politicians. During his first term from 2017 to 2021, he had imposed harsh sanctions, recognized Juan Guaido as interim president, and repeatedly suggested that military action against Maduro was on the table. When he left office in January 2021, he had been frustrated that Maduro was still in power, that all the pressure hadn't been enough to force him out. Now Trump was coming back, and he was making clear that Venezuela would be a top priority. In speeches and interviews during his campaign, Trump had talked about getting tough on Venezuela, about finishing what he had started, about making sure the Venezuelan people got the freedom they deserved. Some of this was certainly rhetoric, the kind of tough talk that politicians engage in during campaigns. But people who knew Trump understood that he didn't like unfinished business, that he remembered the Maduro regime as something that had defied him, and that he might be looking for vindication. Maduro, for his part, seemed to treat Trump's return with a mix of defiance and nervousness. In public statements, he claimed Venezuela was ready for whatever Trump might try, that the Bolivarian revolution could not be defeated by imperialist aggression. But behind the scenes, the regime was preparing for the possibility of increased pressure, maybe even military action. They moved assets, tried to secure additional support from Russia and China, strengthened defenses around key government facilities. On January 20, 2025, Trump was inaugurated for his second term as President of the United States. Within his first weeks back in office, he made clear that Venezuela was indeed a priority. He appointed Venezuela hardliners to key positions in his administration. He increased funding for democracy promotion efforts in the region. He began coordinating with Latin American allies who wanted to see Maduro gone. And he started publicly discussing options for dealing with the Venezuelan dictatorship. In speeches and statements, Trump began framing the Venezuela situation not just as a human rights issue or a democracy issue, but as a national security issue. He pointed to the narco-trafficking connections, calling Venezuela a narco-state that was flooding the United States with cocaine. He highlighted the humanitarian crisis, the millions of Venezuelan refugees who had fled to neighboring countries and were now trying to reach the U.S. southern border. He argued that Maduro's regime was a destabilizing force in Latin America, threatening U.S. allies, harboring terrorists, cooperating with hostile powers like Russia and Iran. This rhetorical shift was significant because it laid the groundwork for more aggressive action. If Venezuela was simply a country with an authoritarian government, then U.S. options were limited to sanctions and diplomatic pressure. But if Venezuela was a threat to U.S. national security, if it was actively harming American interests through drug trafficking and refugee flows, then the range of possible responses expanded considerably. In the summer of 2025, the Trump administration began imposing what it called maximum pressure on Venezuela. New sanctions targeted anyone doing business with the Maduro regime. The U.S. Navy increased its presence in the Caribbean, ostensibly to combat drug trafficking but clearly also as a show of force. Trump repeatedly stated that all options were on the table when it came to Venezuela, a phrase that in diplomatic language signals the possibility of military action. Maduro responded with his usual mix of defiance and conspiracy theories. He claimed that the United States was planning an invasion, that American forces were massing on Venezuelan borders, that he was rallying the Venezuelan people to defend the homeland against imperialist aggression. He held military exercises, moving troops and equipment around the country. He gave speeches promising to fight to the death rather than surrender to foreign intervention. The situation escalated throughout 2025. There were reports of U.S. Special Operations Forces conducting reconnaissance missions near Venezuela's borders. There were rumors of secret communications between the Trump administration and disaffected Venezuelan military officers, discussions about what might happen if those officers turned against Maduro. The U.S. Southern Command, which oversees U.S. military operations in Latin America, was reportedly drawing up plans for various scenarios, from targeted strikes to full-scale invasion. In December 2025, Trump made a dramatic announcement. He ordered the U.S. Navy to establish a blockade of Venezuelan ports. No ships would be allowed to enter or leave Venezuelan territorial waters without inspection. Any vessel suspected of carrying drugs, weapons, or oil would be boarded and searched. Any ship that resisted would be seized. The blockade, Trump said, would remain in place until Maduro stepped down and allowed free elections to be held. This was an act of war in all but name. Blockading another country's ports is considered a use of force under international law. It was similar to what the United States had done to Cuba during the missile crisis in 1962, though this time without the Cold War nuclear danger. The international reaction was swift and divided. U.S. allies in Latin America and Europe mostly supported the action, arguing that extraordinary measures were justified given Venezuela's humanitarian crisis and Maduro's theft of the 2024 election. But Russia, China, and other nations condemned it as illegal aggression. The United Nations Security Council held emergency meetings, but the divisions between permanent members made any unified action impossible. For Maduro, the blockade was devastating. Venezuela's economy, already in ruins, depended on being able to export oil and import food, medicine, and other essentials. With ports blockaded, tankers couldn't dock to load crude oil. Cargo ships couldn't bring in supplies. The country, which had been slowly recovering from the worst of the hyperinflation and shortages, faced the prospect of total economic collapse. Food stocks began running low. Gas stations started running out of fuel, an ironic shortage in what should have been one of the world's most oil-rich nations. Power outages increased as fuel for generators became scarce. Maduro tried to break the blockade. Venezuelan naval vessels attempted to escort cargo ships through, but they were outmatched by U.S. destroyers and frigates. The Venezuelan Air Force made a few patrol flights but didn't engage with U.S. aircraft, probably recognizing that any confrontation would end badly. There were a few tense incidents where Venezuelan vessels came close to U.S. ships, where warnings were issued and ignored, but no shots were fired. Both sides seemed to understand that actual combat would escalate the situation beyond anyone's control. As weeks passed and the blockade held, pressure built inside Venezuela. The military, which had kept Maduro in power for so long, was getting restless. Senior officers were seeing their bank accounts frozen by U.S. sanctions. They were watching the economy collapse even further. They were hearing from family members who wanted to leave the country but couldn't. And they were calculating whether their loyalty to Maduro was worth the risk of being on the losing side if the situation deteriorated further. Intelligence reports reaching the Trump administration suggested that cracks were forming in the military's support for Maduro. Key officers were making discreet inquiries about what would happen to them if Maduro fell. Would they be prosecuted? Could they retire peacefully? Would the US offer any guarantees? The Trump administration was careful in its responses, not making promises they couldn't keep, but also not closing doors. The message was clear: if you help remove Maduro, we can talk about what comes next. If you keep supporting him, you're going down with him. Maria Corina Machado, still in hiding inside Venezuela, was in regular contact with the Trump administration through intermediaries. She was providing information about the situation on the ground, about which military officers might be persuaded to defect, about where opposition supporters could be mobilized if the right moment came. Edmundo González, from his exile in Spain, was doing the same, coordinating with international leaders, preparing for the possibility that he might need to return to Venezuela to lead a transitional government. On January 2, 2026, something happened that made Trump decide to act. According to reports that emerged later, US intelligence received credible information that Maduro was planning to flee Venezuela. He had apparently arranged for a Russian or Chinese aircraft to land at a remote airstrip, ready to fly him to safety if things got too dangerous. The intelligence suggested he might leave as soon as the next day or two, escaping before he could be captured, potentially taking with him documents, money, and information that could expose his criminal networks. Trump made the decision that night. The blockade wasn't enough. Sanctions weren't enough. If they waited, Maduro would slip away and continue to be a problem from exile, directing operations, funneling drug money, making trouble. The only way to truly resolve the Venezuela situation was to remove him from the equation entirely. And that meant going in and getting him. The operation was planned and executed with extraordinary speed. Within 18 hours of Trump's decision, US Special Operations Forces were on the ground in Venezuela. The exact details of how they got there remain classified, but the broad outlines are clear. Teams of Navy SEALs and Army Special Forces operators infiltrated Caracas and other key locations. They had intelligence on where Maduro and his inner circle would be that night. They had detailed floor plans of the facilities. They had informants inside who could help them navigate security. The strikes began at 2:07 a.m. on January 3, 2026. Explosions lit up the Caracas sky as US aircraft hit military installations, taking out command and control facilities, radar installations, and air defense systems. The goal wasn't to destroy Venezuela's military but to blind it, to prevent any organized response to the operation that was unfolding. Within minutes, Venezuelan military communications were disrupted. Officers trying to rally their units found that their orders weren't getting through. Chaos spread as no one knew exactly what was happening or how to respond. At the same time, special operations teams were moving on their targets. The primary objective was Maduro himself, who intelligence had placed at a military facility on the outskirts of Caracas. A team of about 30 operators approached the compound, neutralized the guards with suppressed weapons and tactical precision, and breached the building. They found Maduro in an interior room with several bodyguards and members of his inner circle, including his wife Cilia Flores. There was no firefight. The bodyguards, confronted by heavily armed American special operators using night vision equipment and moving with practiced efficiency, recognized that resistance would be suicide. They surrendered. Maduro himself, according to later reports, seemed almost relieved. He had been living under enormous stress for years, constantly looking over his shoulder, never sure who he could trust. Now the decision was out of his hands. It was over. Within 20 minutes of the breach, Maduro and Flores were in flex cuffs, blindfolded, and being moved to an extraction point. A US military helicopter, flying low and fast, picked them up and headed for the coast. Other operations were unfolding simultaneously across Caracas and Venezuela. Key government and military officials, those closest to Maduro, those most complicit in the regime's crimes, were being rounded up. Not all of them. Capturing the entire Venezuelan government would have been impossible. But the top layer, the people who made decisions and gave orders, they were the targets. By dawn on January 3, Nicolás Maduro was aboard the USS Iwo Jima, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship that had been positioned off the Venezuelan coast as part of the blockade operation. He was in a small compartment, still blindfolded and wearing large headphones that blocked out sound, ensuring he couldn't communicate with anyone or gather intelligence about where he was or where he was going. His wife was in a similar condition in an adjacent compartment. The operation had been a success. American casualties were minimal, a few operators with minor injuries, no deaths. Venezuelan casualties were also relatively light. A few guards had been killed when they resisted. Some military personnel had been injured in the strikes on installations. But there was no battle, no major fighting, no mass bloodshed. The operation had been surgical, focused, designed to decapitate the regime while minimizing collateral damage. The reaction in Venezuela was confusion followed by celebration followed by anxiety. When news spread that Maduro had been captured, that he was gone, thousands of people poured into the streets. They celebrated, waving Venezuelan flags, embracing strangers, crying tears of joy and relief. The nightmare was over. The dictator was gone. Venezuela could start again. But there was also fear. What would come next? Who was in charge now? Would there be violence as different factions competed for power? Would the military try to install another strongman? Would the country descend into chaos? The Trump administration moved quickly to address these concerns. Within hours, Trump was on television announcing Maduro's capture. He explained that Maduro was being brought to the United States to face charges of narco-terrorism and other crimes. He assured the Venezuelan people that the United States had no intention of occupying Venezuela or installing a puppet government. He called on Venezuelan military and civilian leaders to work with the opposition to establish a transitional government and hold new elections. And he announced that Edmundo González, the man who had won the 2024 election, was returning to Venezuela to help lead the transition. González was on a plane from Spain within hours, accompanied by international observers and representatives from various Latin American governments. Maria Corina Machado emerged from hiding and gave a speech broadcast across Venezuela, urging calm, promising that justice would be done, calling for unity and reconciliation. The National Assembly, which had been sidelined under Maduro but still existed as an institution, convened an emergency session to discuss next steps. There was resistance, of course. Some military units loyal to Maduro or uncertain about what was happening took defensive positions. Some collectivos threatened violence against anyone who cooperated with what they called the American invasion. But without leadership from the top, without Maduro to give orders and rally supporters, the resistance was disorganized and half-hearted. Within days, most of these holdouts had stood down. The military high command, many of whom had been secretly negotiating with the Americans, announced they would support a transitional government and respect the will of the Venezuelan people. The international reaction was predictable. U.S. allies generally supported the action, with some expressing reservations about the precedent it set. Latin American nations that had opposed Maduro welcomed his removal while emphasizing the need for Venezuela to determine its own future. Russia and China condemned the operation as illegal aggression and a violation of sovereignty. Cuba and Nicaragua declared it an imperialist coup. Iran called it kidnapping. But without Maduro in power, without the Venezuelan government to coordinate with, there was little any of them could do beyond issuing statements. At the United Nations, there were debates about whether the operation violated international law, whether the United States should face sanctions, whether this set a dangerous precedent. But the Security Council was divided, and no resolutions passed. The reality was that much of the world, even many nations that condemned the method, were quietly relieved that Maduro was gone. Venezuela under Maduro had been a humanitarian catastrophe, a source of regional instability, a narco-state that threatened the entire hemisphere. His removal, however it had been accomplished, created an opportunity for something better. On January 4, 2026, Donald Trump posted the image that would define the operation. Maduro in a grey tracksuit, blindfolded and wearing headphones, sitting on a ship bound for New York. The image was stark, almost shocking in its directness. This was a former head of state, a man who had ruled a country for 13 years, reduced to a prisoner being transported like a common criminal. But Trump's message was clear: tyrants who steal elections, who traffic drugs, who destroy their countries, would face consequences. American power, when directed decisively, could still shape outcomes. Maduro arrived in New York on January 5. He was taken to a federal facility where he would await trial on charges that had been filed against him back in 2020. The indictment was extensive: conspiracy to import cocaine, narco-terrorism, weapons offenses, money laundering. U.S. prosecutors had been building their case for years, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, tracing financial transactions. They were confident they could prove that Maduro had been at the center of a massive criminal enterprise that had used the Venezuelan state to facilitate drug trafficking on an unprecedented scale. Maduro's lawyers immediately challenged his detention, arguing that he had been kidnapped from Venezuelan territory in violation of international law, that the U.S. had no jurisdiction to prosecute him, that he was entitled to immunity as a head of state. But U.S. prosecutors countered that Maduro's immunity had ended when he was removed from power, that the crimes he was charged with were not official acts deserving of immunity, that his government had never been legitimately elected and therefore he was never truly a legal head of state. The legal battles would take months or years to resolve. But as far as Venezuela was concerned, Maduro was finished. He would spend the rest of his life in an American prison, or possibly in exile somewhere if he ever managed to secure release. He would never return to power. His story, the story of the bus driver who became president and then prisoner, was over. As all of this unfolds in real time, as you lie there listening to this story, Venezuela is entering a new chapter. Edmundo González has been sworn in as transitional president. Maria Corina Machado is working with him to establish a government of national unity. The National Assembly is drafting plans for new elections. International aid is beginning to flow into the country. Venezuelan refugees are considering whether they might be able to return home. The future is uncertain, full of challenges, but also full of possibility for the first time in more than 2 decades. The entire story of Nicolás Maduro, from bus driver to dictator to prisoner, spans 6 decades and traverses one of the most dramatic national collapses in modern history. His early life in a working-class Caracas neighborhood gave him a connection to Venezuela's poor and a political education in leftist organizing. His years driving buses and working in the labor movement prepared him for the political struggles to come. His loyalty to Hugo Chávez during the 1990s and 2000s opened doors and created opportunities. His steady rise through the ranks of the Chavista government, from National Assembly member to foreign minister to vice president, positioned him to inherit power when Chávez died. But once in power, Maduro proved to be a disaster. He lacked Chávez's charisma and vision. He couldn't inspire people the way his predecessor had. He was a manager trying to play the role of revolutionary leader, and he failed at both. Under his rule, Venezuela's economy collapsed. Hyperinflation destroyed people's savings and made basic goods unaffordable. Shortages created humanitarian crisis. Millions fled the country. Those who remained struggled to survive. Politically, Maduro was an authoritarian who had learned all the wrong lessons from Chávez. He saw how Chávez had concentrated power and decided to go further. He destroyed democratic institutions, rigged elections, imprisoned opponents, unleashed security forces and armed militias on protesters. He transformed Venezuela from a democracy, however flawed, into a dictatorship. And when the 2024 election threatened his hold on power, he simply stole it in plain sight, daring the world to do something about it. What makes Maduro's story particularly tragic is that the Bolivarian revolution had started with genuine ideals, with real desire to help Venezuela's poor, to create a more just society, to challenge the corrupt elites who had mismanaged the country for decades. Many of the people who supported Chávez and later Maduro did so for good reasons. They had been left behind by the old system. They wanted change. But what they got was a regime that, in the end, was even more corrupt, even more oppressive, even more destructive than what had come before. The lesson of Maduro's rise and fall isn't that revolutionary change is impossible or that left-wing politics inevitably leads to dictatorship. It's that power corrupts, that democratic institutions matter, that economic mismanagement has real consequences, and that charismatic leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems often create disasters. Venezuela had enormous wealth, vast oil reserves, capable people, natural resources that should have made it prosperous. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about what happens when a government values ideology over reality, loyalty over competence, control over freedom. Nicolás Maduro is now in an American prison cell, awaiting trial, his political career over, his freedom gone. The man who once rode through Caracas on city buses, collecting fares and dreaming of a better Venezuela, ended up riding in a military helicopter with a blindfold over his eyes, a prisoner of war in a conflict he couldn't win. The revolution he claimed to serve consumed him, as revolutions often do. The power he clung to so desperately slipped through his fingers. And the country he ruled for 13 years is now trying to rebuild from the ruins he left behind. As you drift off to sleep, as this long story comes to its end, rest in the knowledge that history continues to unfold, that no dictator rules forever, that people who suffer under oppression eventually find their way to freedom, even if the path is long and difficult. Nicolás Maduro's story is finished. Venezuela's story continues. And somewhere tonight, in Caracas and across that battered but resilient nation, people are sleeping with hope for the first time in years, dreaming of a future that might finally be better than their past. If you found this story helpful for falling asleep, if you enjoyed learning about this complex chapter of modern history, consider giving this video a like. It helps other people find it when they're looking for something to listen to at night. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this, more deep dives into history told in a way that helps you relax and drift off. And leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from, what time it is where you are, and what other historical topics you'd like to hear about. I read every comment and I use your suggestions to decide what to cover next. History is full of stories like Maduro's, stories of ambition and power, of idealism corrupted and dreams destroyed, of people trying to change the world and ending up just adding to its suffering. But history also has stories of resilience, of people enduring, of nations recovering from even the worst disasters. Those stories are worth telling too, worth listening to, worth remembering as we navigate our own complicated times. Thank you for listening. Sleep well. And remember that even the longest night eventually gives way to morning, even the darkest chapter eventually turns a new page. Rest easy, knowing that the arc of history, however slowly it may bend, tends toward justice. Good night.